So I'm focusing on the 5 focusing steps, which are the practical method for improving any operation. So the first thing is that managers must identify a constraint, then they must maximize the performance of the constraint, then align the rest of the system around it, and then their fourth step is that they increase capacity when necessary. And then the fifth and final step of this is to begin the process once a new constraint appears. So I will be talking about the first step to identify the system's constraint or the process limits of the entire operation. So in the goal, Alex realizes that Herbie is slowing down the Boy Scout hike because he's just slow and can't keep up with the rest of the group. And no matter how fast the rest of the group goes, they're only as fast as their weakest member. So this also connects to our class because during the car wash simulation, I identified that the hand drying station became a very big bottleneck because the cars that accumulated there took away from the other stations that had available capacity. And then the step 2 is to exploit the constraint. In the goal, Alex made sure that the bottleneck machines never sat idle and that they were always going no matter what, even though they were weak. But it was just to get the maximum performance out of the constraint without making any major changes. And like during the car wash simulation, I kept the bottleneck station operating continuously instead of improving the resources and the stations that already had excess capacity. And the third step is to make sure that every part of the process can support this constraint. So in the goal, instead of wasting resources, they made sure that the non-bottleneck machines would only produce what the bottleneck machines could handle. And during the ERP sim, I really learned that ordering any excessive inventory really created a bunch of unnecessary costs that would weigh me down. And so I just made all my decisions on what had to support production needs instead of just trying to maximize my inventory, and that way I didn't have to deal with machine costs or warehouse costs or any of that. I just focused on the real problem. And then the fourth step is to elevate the constraint, and it's just to finally start investing into the constraint when there's nothing else, and just to increase the capacity of the constraint if it still has a limiting performance. And like in the goal, Alex would use the capacity of the bottleneck machines to improve the factory throughput. He would always have them working, and that way the rest of the company and the rest of the factory could still be producing. During the car wash simulation, I really invested my budget into increasing the capacity of the bottleneck stations instead of spreading my resources evenly across every station, because it would have been a waste if I did that, because I would have still had to deal with the limits of the bottleneck station. And then the fifth step is to repeat the process. Alex realized that no matter what happens, there would always need to be continuous improvement, and new constraints would always emerge. During my ERP sim, every decision that I made had new challenges. If I specialized on the inventory, that would mean I would have to watch out for just not having enough inventory and out of stocking. But every new thing that I did had led to another problem. And That's the process. You got to keep on finding the bottleneck, realizing what it is, and then just trying to either max out that, and then when that does not work, improving the systems around them to function and accommodate that bottleneck. And push comes to worst, you just have to improve it or get further investment into it. And I really think that there's also a real world example of this in Boeing. With Boeing, the 737 aircraft has really had a bunch of production bottlenecks due to the shortages of key components and the quality issues of suppliers. And this really slowed down the entire assembly process because the airplane could not be completed if one critical part was missing. By following the 5-foot steps, Boeing identified what the constraint was by determining which suppliers and production stages were causing the biggest delays. And then they exploited the constraint by prioritizing the critical components and ensuring that the production stages were always supplied with the resources that they needed. Then they subordinated the rest of the production system by adjusting schedules of other departments to work around the bottleneck instead of producing unnecessary work in progress inventory. And then they worked to elevate the constraints by increasing production capacity and strengthening their quality control. And when they finally improved their bottleneck, they continued to monitor production because new constraints would constantly pop up. So I just think that's a great example that demonstrates what Goldart teaches in the goal, and it improves the entire system by focusing on a constraint rather than trying to improve every part of the process equally.